Welcome to the X-SPECT day here. I'm Andy Clark, I'm the PI on the X-SPECT project. Like to thank a few people, Sam Wilkinson for doing a lot of organising here, the ERC for funding the X-SPECT project, the School of Informatics for letting us have this lovely room, and PPLS for generally supporting the project too. So what we're going to do in this first session is we're just going to introduce the project. Sam is going to introduce the sort of shape of the project, and then I'm going to say something about how we're going to solve the hard problem of conscious experience in about 10 minutes.
That long?
that's how it's going to go. So, Sam.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy said, I'm going to be presenting the shape of our project. So it's a 4-year ERC-funded project, and the team consists of these people. So there's Andy as PI, David Carmel as a co-investigator. I'm a postdoc in philosophy. Frank Schumann is a postdoc in psychology. Catherine Nave is a doctoral student in philosophy, and George Dean is also a doctoral student in philosophy. And we've also got a stellar cast of extended project network members. So we've got Carl, who's here, Anil Seth, who's also here, down in Sussex, Andreas Ropstov, Lars Muckli, and Philip Schins. And our aim is very modest. It's simply to understand the nature and possibility of consciousness. So, but specifically through the lens of predictive processing. Okay. But there's this tricky word, consciousness, and that tends to refer to at least two things, and likely more. So something more low level, like what its likeness, and we might want to attribute that to things that are further down the phylogenetic ladder, so to speak. And something more sophisticated, like self-awareness, that might be more bound up in sort of sociality, and that we might only attribute to social animals. Okay, and we're interested in both. In fact, we're potentially interested in anything that might be called consciousness. Okay. So why is the project called Expecting Ourselves? Well, the phrase "expecting ourselves" is actually borrowed from Dan's commentary to Andy's BBS paper, and it nicely reflects the sort of core hypothesis of our project in the broadest sense, which is that self-prediction of potentially various forms might hold the key to explaining conscious experience. Right. So the idea is that we don't just model the world, but we model ourselves within the world. And we don't just react to and predict the world, but we predict those reactions and predict those predictions. Okay. So that's our basic angle. And because all that we're trying to do is understand the nature and possibility of consciousness, we've rather helpfully divided it into 3 sub-projects. Okay, so the first sub-project is prediction, experience, and motor action. The second is the interceptive dimension, and the third is culture and self-prediction. Okay. So you might ask the question, why is conscious experience the way that it is? And some answers to this might be informed by the fact that an organism's perceptual history shapes its priors, and an organism constructs and deploys deep hierarchical generative models relevant to the kinds of action that it needs to perform. Right? And importantly, there's a whole empirical dimension to our project. So each of these sub-projects will involve empirical probing. Right? So just to gesture towards some of the empirical probing that we're about to start doing, we're going to be looking at binocular rivalry and looking at ways of generating a predictive sequence to see if that can bias binocular rivalry. And then we're going to look at ways of interfering with that through TMS, through transcranial magnetic stimulation. Okay. And we're also going to, on the action side of things, we're going to look at ways in which in which you can generate associations between actions, in particular saccades, so that'll take the form of an eye tracking study. Okay, so the second sub-project is the interceptive dimension. Right? And you could see the core question here as being, how important is interoception, and hence embodiment, to consciousness? And our answer is very. But the nature of this importance is important. So do you need this just for human consciousness or for any kind of consciousness? Could a computer be conscious, for example? Right. And here, with hopefully in collaboration with people from Sussex, we'll be doing work on interoception and how that influences conscious experience. The third sub-project is culture and self-prediction. And here, the question is, how important are socio-cultural aspects of cognition for our understanding of consciousness? And that they could potentially be very important. So here's a working hypothesis. If you remember, I said that consciousness, the word consciousness, is a bit ambiguous. So perhaps the more advanced, reflective, self-aware forms of conscious experience arise when the prediction machinery initially used on others is turned upon ourselves. Right? So for some of you who were here yesterday, that was very much a theme running through some of the talks. Okay, so there are lots of different problems that touch on conscious experience. Right? So here are just a few. And you might think that what we're doing is just tackling the easier ones, right? So why is a given conscious experience the way that it is and not some other way, right? So this could involve explaining why we're subject to certain visual illusions, or why we experience binocular rivalry. Why is human consciousness the way that it is and not some other way? Right? So this could be a very kind of species-specific thing, and we could say, look, well, you know, bats and spiders or whatever, they might have something like consciousness, but we're interested in specifically human consciousness. Right? We might ask, what are the necessary ingredients for something, anything, an organism, a robot, a computer, to count as conscious? And then there's the question, well, what is the relationship, generally speaking, between non-conscious brain stuff and consciousness stuff, right? Qualia, right? And a big question is, can predictive processing bring us any closer to answering this last hard question? Right? And with that, I'm going to pass on to Andy.
Yeah, so do we have a way here of beginning to look at the hard problem? What I'm going to say here is very seamless with what we were talking about yesterday. So good news for those of us that were here yesterday. Some of it might seem a little bit out of blue for people that weren't. One of the things that was coming up an awful lot yesterday was a question about whether there was something about modeling yourself that was going to somehow help unravel some of these mysteries. And then the question that has become more prominent for me is, what does it even mean for something to be part of a model of itself here? You know, what are the conditions on actually counting as a model rather than something a little bit weaker like a content item in a bigger model, a generative model? So I don't know if I'll be able to bring this out here, but let's have a go. We're going to start with some classic Dennett stuff. So this is, you know, right on top of Dan's talk from yesterday. Where do we start? No double transduction in the brain. I think that's a core Dan move. What happens is animals are hit by a bunch of stuff. The sense organs turn that stuff into whatever they turn it into, eventually spike trains and so on. That's all the brain gets. and those things get processed, they yield more things, and actions happen. So you might think, okay, this is all responding to energies, doing stuff inside the brain, pushing stuff out into the world. Do we need anything more than that? Dan's thought is that there's just no role available here for transduction into something else. There's no point somewhere along that complicated pathway to turning those sorts of energies and transformed energies into qualia, and then turning those into something else again in order to drive apt behavior, including verbal responses like, oh, I see that lovely red thing, I'm enjoying the taste of that ice cream, and so on. So no need for an inner viewing. And once upon a time, long ago, this used to be thought of as quining qualia, out of existence. To quine something from the philosophical lexicon is to deny resolutely the existence or importance of something real or significant. To, as it were, say of something that appears real and important that it's just not there. And that will always be surprising. You think I quine, sir? I assure you I do not. Yeah. So, no need for intervening qualia. Take the energies and do the right stuff with them. Lots of complicated transformations in there. Sometimes this is thought of as cutting out the middle toad. You just don't need that little middle viewing inside the toad to get the right things done. So that's a good start, but it can't be a finish. So the other big sort of strategy here is to say something about why, assuming that's all that's actually, in some sense, really going on, it seems to us as if we're doing all this other stuff. Rotating mental images, having experiences of yellow chairs, feeling nervous that the equipment isn't working, etc., etc. So again, a classic Dan example, the sweet taste of honey. Dan likes to perform a strange inversion on the sweet taste of honey. We think we like the honey because it tastes sweet, but maybe that's the wrong way round. Maybe, in fact, the sweet taste of the honey is really just our grip on a subtle complex of our own reactive dispositions. So we know certain stuff, like we're going to approach things like that. I'm going to want to smear that on my slice of bread more than I'm going to want to smear something else on it. So the idea would be that that complex of reactive dispositions comes first, and as we kind of watch our own behavior unfold in the world, well, we think, oh, that's an interesting pattern there in our behavior. We dub the things that evoke that complex of responses as sweet. So it's not the sweetness that powers your response. Rather, your response is in a way the thing that is described by the sweetness. So that's when we're supposed to make a mistake. We kind of project the sweetness onto the world. So we say, okay, it's the honey that tastes sweet. When really what we've got here is a sort of latent variable in a complex model where that latent variable is tracking a bunch of our own reactive dispositions. I think that's the general sort of move here. We make this mistaken projection, we self-diagnose an especially puzzling realm, a realm full of red things, sweet things, cute babies, and so on. When in fact what we've really got are just more content items in our own generative model, but some of these content items are busy tracking our own complexes of reactive dispositions. So that's a lovely move. I think it, it says something about why we might seem to find these things in the world, why they might seem to be so puzzling. But still, it was never quite clear exactly how to cash it all out. And that's where lately, both in the 2015 paper here and in the Bacteria to Bach book, Dan adds a kind of Bayesian twist to the argument. It's a Bayesian twist that we'll pick up on. So the idea here is, as I've been saying, that we use a generative model to meet the incoming sensory stream with a complex web of top-down prediction. Ultimately, those are predictions of how the flux of energy is going to alter as you move through the world. But in order to be on top of that flux of energy, you need to, as it were, unearth lots of patterns in the world, patterns that correspond to things like dogs that move around in certain ways that cats don't move around, and so on. If you fail to predict the sensory flux in these ways, you get prediction errors that recruit new top-down hypotheses. I'm not going to go over the predictive process in architecture. Maybe other people will today. So plausibly, I think, that's the trick that explains how we come to know in perception a structured world, a world full of things like dogs and cats and projectors and microphones. All of those emerge as content items, latent variables in our predictive model of the sensory flux. That doesn't seem too problematic. This is what we see happening already in deep learning systems and stuff like that. So at that point, if you're a philosopher, you're probably going to say, so far so good, but you're not there yet. You've accounted for something like why we judge there to be a structured world, a world full of dogs and cats and rabbits and microphones, and that's a lot, but you haven't really given me qualia back yet. There's something more that I wanted. Oh, that's what I wanted. Big piece of blank qualia. So the idea would be, we don't encounter our structured world in the dark. I don't just, as it were, encounter a world and say dog over there, cat over there, and so on. There's more to it. There's this rich sensory experience of doghood. So the proposal then is that what we need to do is explain why, amongst all these items that populate our generative model, dogs, cats, microphones, other people, mental states for that matter, our own qualitative experiences turn up and seem very puzzling. Okay, so then you can try, this is the thought that we want to try, something like a Bayesian predictive twist. We are objects, Dan says, for our own prediction machinery. To socialize with others and to grapple with our own futures, we need to predict what we ourselves are going to do next. So we're complicated bits of the world that we need to be on top of if we're going to interact successfully with other complicated bits of the world and indeed understand ourselves in the sort of ways that let us plot complicated paths into the future and so on. So among the things that we predict about ourselves, those reactive dispositions seem like they would be an important part. Key idea is that we expect our own reactive dispositions and we reify these as a mysterious qualia that then causes so many problems when we start to think about them as philosophers or indeed cognitive scientists. So here's the example, or an example. It's a bit easier maybe than red. We're not going to try and do red. We can talk about that. The cuteness of babies. Claim is that the cuteness seeming of the baby is just a lot of expectations concerning your own pattern of babyish reactive dispositions. So, you know over time that you're going to coo and nurture and stroke and whatever people do to babies. I'm not entirely sure all the things that you do to babies, but I'm sure these are among them. And the idea is that because we're on top of that stream of our own reactive dispositions, we sort of label that in this simple way. Oh, that's cute. That's kind of why I'm doing this stuff. So it's kind of like a self-explanation, if you like. It's a self-explanation, though, that pushes onto the world something that really is just in us. And maybe that's kind of what's going on all over the place here. We diagnose ourselves as having detected something puzzling. Cuteness seems to be present in the world, just like babiness was. But then if you ask, so, what is cuteness in the world? There doesn't seem to be as much to say as there is to say about, what is babiness in the world, what is doghood. So the idea would be that these are all just disguised predictions of our own web of reactive dispositions. Here's a bit from Dan. When we expect to see the baby in the crib, we also expect to find it cute, we expect to feel the urge to cuddle it, and so forth. Okay. So encountering the world with this kind of model in place, when you don't get prediction error signals, you'll think that your model is, if you like, supported by the lack of prediction error signals. And so the idea that there is cuteness in the world, redness in the world, sweet tastiness in the world, just gets confirmed by the fact that you were on top of these patterns using those kinds of latent variables. So as Dan says, cuteness as a property passes the Bayesian test for being an objective structural feature of the world we live in. Yeah. So there you go. That said that. This is, I think, structurally parallel to the story that Phil Gerrans has recently been telling about the experience of the self. So this was mentioned yesterday. Phil Gerrans and Letherby have been saying that the self is just an inferred cause, a latent variable in the generative model, just like any other. So I think this is just treating qualia in the way that they treat the self. Okay, so another way to put this is I don't infer that I have qualitative experiences because I see red, feel pain, and so on. Instead, seeing red and feeling pain, just like the sense of self, are themselves inferred causes, constructed by the generative model to accommodate the change in sensory flux. So in other words, we don't find qualia in experience. We don't find qualia in raw experience. There is no raw experience. Experience is what you get when you apply the generative model to the complicated sensory flux and extract stuff that lets you stay on top of that sensory flux in the right kind of multi-level way. Okay. So why does pain hurt? Well, because what the generative model here reifies just is a complex of reactive dispositions that we would identify as the kind of thing that hurtiness is, the sort of tendency to move away from, the tendency to take painkillers, all of those kinds of things. So no wonder it hurts. That's what hurting is. It is that complex of reactive dispositions. Story, I think, needs a tiny refinement. I won't linger on this, but we need to make room for qualia surprise. So, you know, you might say, well, what if I didn't expect to find the baby cute? What if I didn't expect to find the honey sweet? And so on. What happens there? What about cases where the cuteness of something comes itself as a big surprise? Are they going to pose a challenge to this kind of reconstruction? I don't think so. I think they just actually reveal its power. So here's an example. If you'd asked me a little while ago if I would find albino squirrels cute, I would have resoundingly, clearly said no. On the whole, a bit suspicious of albino things, don't like squirrels much, very unlikely that I'm going to find albino squirrels cute. But then you see them, and well, I mean, there's no doubt about it, they are cute. I mean, who could say that they're anything but cute? At least, if you're me, you'd have to say they're cute. So what do we say about that? Did I non-consciously predict that I'd find them cute? That sounds kind of crazy. I don't see why I would say that. But still, exposed to this novel sensory barrage, my brain's best hypothesis turned out to be that they were white, fluffy, and cute. But in fact, as it were, spotting them as cute here is no harder, I think, than spotting them as fluffy. What we need to say here is that the raw sensory inputs have plenty of structure in them. What the generative model has been busy doing is trying to make sense of that structure, to find patterns in that structure at multiple levels. So spotting a novel kind of cuteness is no harder, really, than spotting a novel kind of chair as a chair, or a novel kind of automobile as an automobile. It's our systematically structured grip on the world, here realized by this hierarchical generative model, that then does all the work. And that extends, crucially, to our own interoceptive responses and reactive dispositions too. They're not just stored, if you like, in a sort of lookup table fashion. Instead, we have a proper model of our own reactive dispositions that has interoceptive, exteroceptive, and proprioceptive elements in it. So I think once you have the idea that this is a hugely structured system, qualia surprise is, if you like, no surprise. That preserves, I think, Dan's key inversion. The perceived cuteness depends on the emerging urge to stroke, protect, and so on, not the other way around. But it doesn't quite depend on my already expecting to find albino squirrels cute. Their cuteness is part of a hypothesis I construct on the spot to best accommodate the sensory information. Okay. So the upshot, I think, is that what we can say here is that qualia are just more content items in our best model of the world. Asking why we think there are red things or cute things is no different to asking why we think there are cars or radios. They're all latent variables posited by the brain to reduce the dimensionality of the data, including interoceptive data, in the sensory barrage. But we make a mistake here. There is a kind of illusionism here. We mistake them for real features of the world just because although they're looking very much inward at our own reactive dispositions, we treat them as being objective causes because they don't generate any prediction error signals when we come across them. So this is, I think, more like Bayesian qualia. So on the Bayesian view here, dogs, cats, loudness, and redness are all on a par. They're all content items inferred as part of my best generative model that predicts the overall sensory flux. So I think that's actually a kind of partial victory for qualia realists. This doesn't look to me like quining qualia anymore. If qualia are as good as dogs and cats, then I don't think we should think that we've discovered there aren't any. I mean, dogs and cats seem fine to me. Oh, another one of those. Okay. So, yeah, that's what we said. Cool. Yeah. This is, I think, the familiar phenomenal realm successfully constructed without double transduction. Okay, so provocative summary here, nearly finished now, sorry it's gone a little bit long. To build a conscious robot, build a robot that needs to infer that it's conscious. To build a robot that feels pain, build a robot that needs to infer that it feels pain. I'm not saying this is easy. In fact, the funny thing here is that you solve the hard problem before you solve the easy problems, and it doesn't make the easy problems any easier to have solved the hard problem already. But at least you don't have to worry about something nasty lurking around the corner. So, bigger picture, I think what our project ends up exploring is a graded three-dimensional picture of the determinants of conscious experience. One dimension will be the depth and contents of the generative model of worldly causes. The other dimension will be how that model is constantly inflected by this stream of interoceptive and proprioceptive information about how it currently is with me in my body and what kinds of things I might be poised to do right now. And then the third, less obvious dimension will be cognizers that model themselves and their own reactive dispositions in ways that enable them to do complex stuff like coordinate with others, explore possible futures conditioned on their own likes and dislikes. So I think the thing is, we humans score highly along all three of these dimensions, and we've pinned the label consciousness to our little donkey using a high score on those three dimensions. If you start to unravel those dimensions, there's probably not going to be a good answer to a question about whether a system's conscious or not. So, you know, you could have interoceptive richness and I think a fairly shallow self and world model. Maybe that's a hamster or a stick insect or something. You could have a deep but alien world model with no interoception and no self model. And maybe that's what we're getting out of some work in contemporary deep mind systems and so on. And I think as you move further and further away from our spot of scoring highly on all three dimensions, there's just no answer to the question, does that system have qualia, does it have consciousness? Or all you should say is, well, it scores this far on this dimension, this far on this dimension. That's not worrying, I think, if we start to recognize that most of our philosophical puzzlement is just because we fail to see that we model ourselves and our own reactive dispositions in just the same way as we model the rest of the world. So just linking this very briefly to what was going on in the last 2 days, it's not obvious to me that when we do this, we have to spawn a kind of extra standalone model of ourselves. It kind of seems to me like, well, one big multi-area, multi-level generative model of the world has lots of content items in it. Some of them corresponding to ourselves, some of them corresponding to other things. I don't think that means we've spawned another sort of separate model looking at the model. These are just items, content items within one model. But as I said at the beginning, I'm not quite sure how we count either. So there's an issue there. Okay, that's the end. Thanks.